Have you ever noticed how people react when someone cries in public? The room shifts, eyes dart sideways, shoulders tighten, someone clears their throat, and in that heavy silence, the person crying already mid-tear does something remarkable. They apologize. Sorry, I don't know why I'm like this. Sorry, I cry at everything. Sorry, I'm so embarrassing. Not sorry for what they said, not sorry for what they did. Sorry for feeling, sorry for the tears themselves, sorry essentially for being human in the wrong kind of way. Maybe you know this feeling intimately. Maybe you're the one who cries at commercials, the ones with dogs and reunions and slow piano music. Maybe you cry when someone is unexpectedly kind to you, which feels like the strangest betrayal of your own composure. Maybe you cry when you're angry, which is its own specific humiliation, because now you're not just angry, you're angry and crying, and suddenly the argument is about your tears instead of the thing you were actually trying to say. Or maybe you've spent years watching someone you love dissolve at things that seem small to you, and you've wondered privately, guiltily, why are they like this? Here's what most people never stop to ask. What if crying easily isn't a flaw in someone's emotional wiring? What if it's actually a signal one that most of the world has learned to silence instead of listen to? Because here's the quiet truth about people who feel deeply. They don't cry because they're weak. They cry because somewhere along the way, no one ever taught them that their tears were safe, and so the body learned to hold everything. Every wound, every joy, every unspoken word until the weight of it had nowhere left to go but out. And this is where it begins. To understand why some people cry more easily than others, we have to go back, not to a specific moment necessarily, but to a way of being that was shaped long before you had the words to describe it. There's a concept in psychology called emotional sensitivity. And it's not simply about being more emotional in the way people use that phrase dismissively. Psychologists define emotional sensitivity as a heightened responsiveness to both internal and external emotional stimuli. In other words, your nervous system picks up more, feels more, processes more, not because something is broken, but because the system is calibrated differently. Research published in the journal Brain and Behavior found that highly emotionally sensitive individuals show increased activation in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, the regions of the brain responsible for processing both physical pain and social emotion. What this means in plain language is that the emotional pain of rejection, disappointment, or witnessing suffering registers in the sensitive brain the way physical pain registers in others. It's not metaphorical, it is quite literally felt in the body, and crying is the body's release valve for that pressure. But where does this sensitivity come from? Partly it's temperament, something you were born with. Dr. Elaine Aron, a psychologist at Stony Brook University, identified what she called highly sensitive persons, or ASPs. Her research found that roughly 15 to 20% of the population carries a trait of deep sensory and emotional processing, one that appears to be neurological in origin. These individuals don't just experience emotions more intensely, they process the world around them more thoroughly, noticing subtleties others miss, absorbing the emotional atmosphere of a room, feeling the weight of other people's pain as if it were their own. But here's what's important to understand. Sensitivity isn't the whole story, because not everyone who is naturally sensitive cries easily. What shapes how that sensitivity is expressed, what turns inward feeling into visible, unstoppable tears is often what happened to that sensitivity in childhood. Think about this for a moment. When a child cries, what happens next is everything. If a child cries and is met with warmth, held, acknowledged, told that their feelings are real and valid, they begin to build what psychologists call secure emotional regulation. They learn that feelings have a container, that emotions can be expressed and then released, that the wave comes in and the wave goes back out. But what if the child cries and is met with something different? What if they're told, stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about? Or you're being too sensitive? Or, and this one is subtler but just as damaging, what if they simply cry and no one comes? What if their tears are met with discomfort, irritation, silence, or absence? Something shifts in that child. They don't stop feeling. The sensitivity doesn't go away, but they begin to understand, on a wordless cellular level, that their emotions are too much, too loud, too inconvenient, too something. And so the feelings don't disappear, they go underground. They get stored in the body, packed tightly into the chest and throat and the space behind the eyes. And then, at unexpected moments, a kind word, a song, a stranger's grief, a moment of unexpected beauty, the pressure finds a crack and it comes flooding out. A landmark study in the Journal of Research in Personality found that individuals who received dismissive or invalidating emotional responses in childhood were significantly more likely to experience emotional flooding, what we commonly recognize as crying suddenly and intensely, often in response to things that seem minor to others. The tears aren't about the commercial or the argument or the small disappointment. The tears are about everything that was never allowed to be cried before. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's foremost trauma researchers and author of The Body Keeps the Score, writes that the body holds what the mind cannot process. When emotions are repeatedly suppressed, shamed, dismissed, or ignored, they don't vanish. They accumulate in the nervous system, creating what he calls a kind of emotional debt, and the body will always find a way to pay that debt, one way or another. For people who cry easily, the tears are often the body making a payment. So what does this actually look like in a life? How does emotional sensitivity, shaped and sometimes scarred by early experience, show up in the day-to-day reality of a person who feels too much? Let's sit with this for a moment. You might find yourself crying during arguments, not because you're manipulating anyone, but because the emotional intensity of conflict overwhelms your nervous system before you even know what's happening. And then the conversation stops being about what you were trying to say and becomes about your tears, and you feel ashamed, and that shame makes you cry more, and the whole thing collapses under the weight of feelings that had nowhere to go. You might cry at beauty, a piece of music that catches you in exactly the right moment, a sunset that hits differently than expected, a child laughing in a grocery store, and you don't always know why, only that something in you recognizes something out there, something true, or something aching, or something you've lost, and your body responds before your mind can stop it. You might cry when someone is kind to you unexpectedly. This one confuses people, but it is perhaps the most psychologically telling of all. When you have learned to expect emotional distance, when kindness has been inconsistent or conditional in your history, an unexpected act of genuine care can break something open inside you. Because it's not just kindness you're receiving in that moment. It's the contrast, the difference between what you learned to expect and what you are suddenly being given. That gap, that tender ache of, oh, this is what it was supposed to feel like, that is what the tears are made of. You might cry at other people's pain more than your own. This is the signature of someone with high empathy, that neurological attunement to others that Aron described. Your mirror neurons, the brain cells responsible for emotional resonance, fire so strongly in response to witnessed suffering that your body produces the same physiological response as if you yourself were the one hurting. This isn't weakness, it's the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do: connect. It's just doing it at a volume the world hasn't always known how to handle. But here's the truth: most people who cry easily have never been told. The problem was never your sensitivity. The problem was the message you received about it, because somewhere between childhood and adulthood, most deeply feeling people absorb a story about themselves. The story says, you are too much. The story says, your emotions are inconvenient, embarrassing, immature. The story says, learn to control yourself. And so you try. You swallow the tears in meetings. You bite the inside of your cheek to stop yourself shaking. You laugh instead of cry at funerals, because crying feels like falling apart in public, and falling apart feels dangerous. You become incredibly skilled at performing composure, at holding the surface still, even as something vast and heavy moves beneath it. Psychologists call this emotional suppression, and it is not the same as emotional regulation. Regulation means you acknowledge what you feel and choose how to express it. Suppression means you pretend the feeling isn't there, and research from psychological science showed that emotional suppression doesn't reduce the emotional experience. It actually amplifies it internally, while reducing the external signal. In other words, when you force yourself not to cry, you don't feel less. You feel more, alone with it, invisible, carrying the weight of something that was never allowed to exist. This is the paradox of people who cry easily. The world tells them they feel too much, but the truth is, they've been asked to feel in secret, to contain the ocean, to be the reservoir that never overflows, and the overflowing, the unexpected tears, the sudden dissolution in unexpected moments is not a failure of control. It is the body, finally, insisting on the truth. Now let's talk about what this does to relationships. When you cry easily, intimacy can become a minefield. You want closeness. You feel things so deeply that connection is not optional for you. It is necessary, and yet every time you cry in front of someone, you brace for the reaction. Will they be uncomfortable? Will they pull away? Will they make it about them? Will they say, as so many have, why are you crying? It's not a big deal. Those 5 words, they land like a verdict. Not a big deal, meaning your feelings are not a big deal. You are not a big deal, and so you learn to hide, not yourself. Exactly, but the fullest version of yourself. You show the regulated version, the composed version, the version that has learned through years of practice to keep the tears for later, for the shower, for the car ride home, for the 3 a.m. moments when no one is watching. But here's where it gets interesting: the people around you. The ones who have learned not to cry, who pride themselves on composure, who call themselves rational, they often feel things just as deeply. They've simply built different walls, different armor, and somewhere underneath, they're drawn to you, even if they don't know why, because you feel things openly, because you bleed where they have learned to clot, and there is something in that rawness that reminds them of the part of themselves they buried a long time ago. The most emotionally expressive people in a room are often carrying the emotional weight for the room. They are feeling not just their own feelings, but the feelings everyone else has learned to suppress, and they're doing it alone, apologizing for it, shrinking themselves around it. At what cost? Carl Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And I think about that when I think about deeply feeling people, because you have spent years, decades, maybe trying to accept a version of yourself that was acceptable to others. You've worked to smooth your edges, quiet your tears, be less, to take up less emotional space, to manage yourself on behalf of everyone else's comfort. But here is the invisible truth that most people miss. Emotional sensitivity is not a disorder. It is not a phase you haven't grown out of. It is not a character flaw to be corrected. In almost every spiritual and philosophical tradition throughout human history, the capacity to feel deeply has been considered a gift, sometimes a sacred one. The Japanese concept of mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of things, is a kind of cultivated sensitivity, a willingness to be moved by beauty and loss and the passage of time. It is not considered weakness, it is considered a form of wisdom. Gabor, the physician and trauma researcher, argues that emotional sensitivity in children is frequently a response to emotional environments that were unpredictable or unsafe. The child who becomes hyperattened to emotional shifts is doing something intelligent. They are reading the room, scanning for safety, trying to predict the emotional weather of the people around them in order to protect themselves. That sensitivity was a survival skill. It was clever. It was adaptive. The tragedy is not that you developed it. The tragedy is that no one ever told you afterward that you were safe, that you didn't need to keep scanning, that the storm had passed, and so the nervous system kept vigil long after it needed to. The tears, the easy, unexpected, unstoppable tears, are sometimes the nervous system finally lowering its guard, releasing the breath it's been holding, a body so practiced in vigilance that when it finally feels safe or beautiful or seen, it doesn't know how to respond quietly. It responds with everything it has. That is not weakness. That is a body that survived something and is learning slowly to exhale. We're nearing the end of something important, and I want to leave you with this gently. Healing for people who feel deeply doesn't look like feeling less. It doesn't look like finally achieving composure or training the tears out of yourself or becoming the kind of person who doesn't cry at commercials. That is not healing. That is just a different kind of loss. Healing begins with the radical, almost terrifying act of deciding that your sensitivity is not something to be corrected, that your tears are not evidence of damage, but of depth, that the part of you that has been apologizing, the part that says sorry for feeling, sorry for existing like this, deserves to be met with something different than shame. It begins often with finding one person, just one, in whose presence you do not need to manage yourself. Someone who does not flinch when you cry, who does not rush to fix it or silence it, who can simply sit in the presence of your feeling without needing it to stop. Research from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology suggests that emotional validation from even a single consistent relationship can begin to rewire the patterns formed by years of dismissal. One person, one witness, that is sometimes enough to change the architecture of how you carry yourself. You can choose slowly to stop apologizing for your tears, not all at once, not in every room, but you can begin to notice when the apology rises. Sorry, I don't know why I'm like this, and ask yourself what it would mean to not say it, to let the tear fall without a sentence explaining why you deserve forgiveness for it. You can start to understand your sensitivity not as a wound but as a form of intelligence, the kind of intelligence that notices things, that feels things, that holds space for others' pain in a way that is genuinely rare and genuinely needed in the world. Research consistently shows that individuals with high emotional sensitivity score significantly higher on measures of empathy, creativity, and interpersonal attunement. The very thing the world has told you is a problem is also one of your most profound gifts. The garden doesn't need to be pruned of its most sensitive blooms. It needs a gardener who finally tends to their own roots. Remember the person who apologized, sorry, I don't know why I'm like this. The one who had learned that their tears were inconvenient, that their feelings were too much, that composure was a performance they had to maintain. You can finally tell them, you don't need to apologize anymore. The tears were never the problem. The silence around them was. You feel deeply, you always have, and the world quietly, desperately needs more people who do. You were never too much. You were simply in rooms too small for everything you carry.